Welcome to Tramlines, a podcast from Agrii. I'm your host, Tony Smith, putting your questions to the experts. In this episode, I'm talking to Colin Lloyd, Head of Agronomy within Agrii's technical team. Today, we're going to examine varietal choice in the context of sustainability, and more specifically, Agrii's Variety Sustainability Rating, and how that fits within their Green Horizons initiative. This podcast also has bases and Naroto points affiliated to it. So, hello there, Colin.
Good morning to you, Tony.
And good morning to you, and thank you so much for spending the time with us this morning, when I know it is a very busy time of year for you as you start those varietal tours and plot demos around the country. So can we start with the basic question? Where do we start with varietal selection?
Very good question, and I think really it's worthy going back a little bit to go forward, so we get a whole sort of layering of the information that we're looking at the moment. And it was in 2016 that we decided to launch our own Agrii advisory list for winter wheat. And the reason for that really was to complement the HDB recommended list system. But there were some divergences in scores which concerned us slightly. So we wanted to get that view across to the farming community. It also gave us an opportunity to add extra features to the list, crop competition, competitiveness scores, and then really the functionality on heavier and lighter soils, and bring all that together. So piecing the bits of jigsaw together to understand what a variety wants and how it performs. So I think from the Agrii Advisory List 2016, it basically meant that we have a network of trials across the country. From there, we take all the data and untreated data, and we actually send this to a lovely lady called Dr. Rosemary Bales, who tries to retire into the Welsh Hills. But actually, we grab her every now and again to use her expertise. And the reason for that, Tony, is that she was head of UK CPBS. So she is a great virologist and gives us a sounding board, a validation really of the data that we're collecting and how best to utilize it. And that's where all the data goes to Rosemary, particularly on the disease aspects I'm talking about here. She would then score them as she would have done in the past. And we have a look and we work together on this and look at the scores with the rest of the techie team. And it's very rare that we disagree with the figure she comes out with. They then become the basis of the scores that we use on the advisory list. I guess the most important thing to say about this at this stage is that we are using only that season's disease data. So we're not averaging anything, we're not weighting anything. It is the latest data. So, if something breaks, for example, in this current season, Tony, it means that it gets that score, not an average of the last 3 years, say.
So what I'm hearing, Colin, is that the data that you're looking to provide agronomists and farmers is so important in terms of them trusting that that's going to give them an insight as to how that crop's going to perform the following year. Is that right?
Oh, it is. And I mean, it's so important to when you're moving on to how safe varieties are, how resilient they are, how sustainable they are. It's like any data. There's good data and there's bad data. And so if we're going to make informed decisions, we want up to date. What has that variety done and how has it performed? And not only on disease, but in other aspects, and also across the regions, because a wheat in Scotland has different needs to a wheat in say Wales or in East Anglia. So we need to be regional as well, but with a national flavour of disease data in particular, so we really know where it's going.
Yeah, and I can hear from what you're saying that this is really important. Colin, let's take a crop like winter wheat and diseases such as septoria and the rust. Which diseases do we have to be very vigilant about when it comes to tracking how they change and how varieties may change in their response to them?
Yeah, I think the the headline was always actually to start with yellow rust. That was something that really inevitably started the Agri advisory list, and the case got a bit more refined since then, with brown rust actually starting to wander in its scores, and now septoria. But if we go back, a classic example, Tony, really is in we have this tussock system, and it's not very glamorous, but it's 12 sites of 35 varieties or parental lines, and those are actually again chosen by Rosemary in particular. So she's looking at the varieties in there, which strains affect each variety, and of course gives us an early warning system. If you're looking at a particular variety and you go, hang on, you're not supposed to have yellow rust, and you now have, something is starting to break perhaps. So the classic really was back in 2017, and one site only had yellow rust starting to appear on Hereford, which Hereford is a parental line to many crosses. And so you took note of that, thought, but okay, you might be an outlier or doing something strange. But anyway, at least we kept an eye on the situation. In 2018, that was across 6 sites. And by 2019, then many varieties with the Hereford parental line was showing breakage in the field. So the important thing for us is that we were able to give an early heads up on those varieties, and they included Gleam, Shabras, Zayat, certainly Dunstan, and they had various levels of yellow rust coming in because of the parental line. But we were able to say, guys and girls, watch what's happening with these varieties and just ensure that the yellow rust is covered. So it was ahead really of its time, but I think that's a really important point. That's what it's designed to do. We want to see, and we don't want to see varieties fail, but when things start to go slightly astray, we want to be able to give that early warning system to say, look, we might have to change our agronomy advice, or the amount of fungicide we use, or indeed which active ingredient we use, to ensure we get the very best out of that variety.
And from what you've been telling us, Colin, that this way of gathering this data in such a responsive way since 2016 sounds incredibly valuable. Did this type of data exist before?
Not really. I mean, I think it also, to be fair to the whole system, so I mean, we all recognize the recommended list as it is, and it's been incredibly useful over decades. But varieties were actually tending to be quite benign on disease. You had the odd misbehaving variety and it broke down, and there were a few except I guess good examples. That Schleppner was one that one day we were all happy with, and the next day, because of its market share, suddenly went pop. But to be honest, it had been fairly benign. But it's really been in this last sort of 6, 7, 8 years when we're starting to see certainly yellow rust in particular start to break in varieties in the parental lines. And I have to say that I think some of it has to be put down to the fact that the breeders are doing their job. They're breeding for yield. They're breeding for the recommended list, and so yield is king, and quite rightly so in most aspects. But I think going forward, what is now becoming increasingly obvious is, the genetic diversity of some of these crosses is quite limited. So, I mentioned Hereford. At the moment, for example, we have lots and lots of cougar crosses. Now, I'm not suggesting right at this moment that that's going to be an issue, but it could well be. That's how the system seems to work at the moment. We have a clutch of parental lines that are very, very similar across breeders, and so we can run into a bit of trouble that way. So that is at the moment really quite relevant to keep us ensuring that we keep our growers and our agronomists advised as to what really is happening, and take it on from there.
Okay, so we've spent a little bit of time talking about the parental lines and talking about disease resistance and what may change. When it comes to your sustainability rating that you spoke about earlier on, what else are you looking for in the varieties?
Okay, so yeah, again, a good lead-on question into really where we're headed right now. So I mentioned the advisory list and the disease scores and the disease ratings and how we get there, and using rosemary as well. We have our heads-up system with the tussocks. Then, of course, there's a bit more than just disease to a variety. So what I was doing was really looking at 13 different metrics. So the variety sustainability rating is built over 13 different aspects, which are all things from lodging. One thing, we don't want the thing to fall over, so we treat these things fairly harshly and push them hard. So the lodging treated score is interesting, but also the lodging untreated score is interesting for us. And just to make sure that's covered. Grain quality, I believe that's another aspect we want. So we want stiff straw, we want decent grain, so that has a score and a rating, and that goes towards the VSR. We also have its second versus first wheat performance. So how does a variety, where is its fit? What are you trying to do with a variety? And if you want a decent second wheat, that is also scored. I love consistency in varieties. I don't want something that's 120 this year and 102 next year in yield. So consistency is important, and that is reflected also in the VSR scores. Another important point, and I guess now is the question most asked of me when I'm talking about varieties and new varieties, when you come along to a plot, and I guess they would say, first of all, is how competitive is it? Now, that's born out of the fact that, of course, grass weeds and resistance to herbicides is well documented and not part of this podcast for sure. But of course, what it did was back in 2004, we started a crop competition trial at our blackgrass centre at Stowlonger near Huntingdon. And it was just a few varieties. And is wheat, or do different varieties actually compete stronger against grass weeds? And that's what we found out very early on, that you can define varieties by their competitiveness. And so that has been used now for many, many years, and it's still running. It's a little larger than it was, and I guess almost too large. But of course, as new varieties come in and breeders want to know if their new line, as far as we're concerned, is competitive or not, well, it goes into the system. But so that is also, of course, part of the VSR score. So I include variety competitiveness. So there's quite a lot of data goes in there. Some of it slightly different, some of it, or almost all of it, much more under pressure. So we don't want to just test varieties in a nice gentle way, because, well, that's twee when you're trying to find out the genetic yield potential. What we want to do is to work out how a variety responds in anger. Getting it on farm, putting it in the ground, how hard does it get pushed? Then we can really get an idea of how robust that variety is. So it's a collection of things, Tony, really.
Yeah, and it really resonates when you talk about the robustness of these varieties, because it's been quite a topic of conversation during these podcasts for growing these crops during the very challenging and difficult growing conditions that we face each year. As you said, growing these varieties in anger. So here's a question. With all the feedback that comes in from agronomists who walk these big areas of these varieties and from growers as well, how do you absorb that feedback into your sustainability ratings?
Yeah, I think there's two ways of looking at it. I think hopefully the data that we're pushing out has a value to the growers. And at this time of year, this is my time of year where I can get real feedback. Well, I can this year in a limited way, obviously, because I'm actually seeing real live people farming.
You're joking. Real live people. Goodness gracious.
Yeah, it's crazy, isn't it? But last year it was so sad in many aspects. But yeah, we got some wonderful work, and I just felt like Billy No Mates really, because there was nobody to see and nobody to come. But the feedback at this time of year is really important. We had a meeting yesterday over in Shropshire, and there's a classic example of them saying, yeah, well, what you were saying about X variety or Y variety, we put it to the test, loving it. Thank you very much. What's next? And of course, they're always looking, okay, been there, done that. I'm not going to drop it in a hurry necessarily, which is what I always say. Look, if things are working, if it ain't broke, don't try and fix it. But of course, we want to make a general progression, and that's the questioning. That's the validation, really, when they come back and actually say, yep, okay, happy with that, next.
So, Colin, I'm hearing a lot about that word validation. And you talked about the tussock trials, the not so glamorous tussock trials that we spoke about a bit earlier on. And you talked about, other trials, the feedback systems that you've got, the input. It sounds to me that validation is almost like the key to what you're doing.
It very much is, Tony. And I think the important thing is that it's no point us doing all of this work. As much as we like doing trials, and I like looking at trials, it's not for me. It's for growers. If we can't ensure that we get the very best information to our agronomists and also our clients, then clearly we have failed. So the actually excitement of the whole thing is to think that people will use this, and there are some really good examples of how things have changed and are changing. And by that, I mean, if we go back to the VSR scores, because I ought to explain. So we've had our 13 metrics, which I mentioned. I've scored them accordingly to their maximum or minimum effect within that trait. So, for example, in the disease, I score or scored triticide at a higher level. Because clearly it's still the main yield robber. So whilst yellow rust is there and emotional, and okay, this year is being a bit of a pain at the moment because of the weather and being able to get on the ground at the right time to spray. Triticide is really the main culprit in amongst the yield loss of the disease we have. So I think you have all these numbers. I add them up at the bottom. Now, it's not very spectacular. It's a spreadsheet. I put all the traits in, give them the scores for the varieties, look at the bottom number. And when we started this VSR system, really what it is we talked about validation a minute ago, but here we go again. We're doing the same thing. So we had the advisory list scores. We knew how consistent varieties had performed over years in the trials. Could you then further subject all of that data to this VSR score, which adds up all the most important traits, how well those varieties have performed, give them a number at the bottom. And interestingly, and most importantly, there is no such thing, of course, as a utopian variety. There is no such thing as maximum points. So neither do we get nil point, as we're quite good at getting now in the UK when we start singing. But here in this relation, the best varieties still don't get to the maximum points numbers that is possible. So it shows that the variety selection is quite diverse in numbers in the VSR scores. But we still have no such thing as a perfect variety. So every time you look at a variety, it will have a little chink in its armor somewhere. The important point is, what is that chink? And is that trait, which is slightly weak in that variety, worth fixing? Because overall, that variety is the package you want it to be.
I've got so many questions to ask you, Colin, but I'm sure we'll have another podcast in the future. Just for the moment, though, you talked about that there's still room for improvement, there's still gaps. Take us forward 2 to 5 years. Where can there be further improvement? What gaps can be filled? There we are. There's a question for you.
Well, again, a cracking lead-on question, because, of course, now we have these scores, and then we talk to the breeders. So of course this is not like a one-way system here. So I'm feeding information, or as the company, the technical department, feeding this information to breeders. We have the conversations, and now the great thing is they're sort of turning around and saying, okay, so what do we want to improve, and can we go through our nurseries to see if we've got something there that more fits what you're looking for? And the interesting part about it is, and I haven't mentioned it, but let's mention it now, in the metrics, there's nothing for yield. So there is no comparison on yield, because my belief is that once you've got so far through the system, all these varieties can yield. Okay, so the differential is a few percent, and a few percent is not necessarily even statistically different. But even if it was, if something's more exposed or is more at risk, you can lose 3% really quite quickly. Our intention with this always has been is looking at traits, not just overall yield. So we're in the situation right now, for example, that we're actually multiplying varieties that haven't made the recommended list by 1.5%, or whatever it might be, but actually have traits that farmers want, or I perceive they want. And I think from the reaction is that's now becoming quite clear. So for example, you can have a variety just a little bit lower yielding, still perfectly good for yield, but septoria scores are higher, the grain's good, the straw's good, it makes a good second wheat. And so, and maybe it also is okay for lighter land as well as heavy. And so you can very quickly look at a variety, because we do the VSR scores. The numbers at the bottom are more important to me than the absolute top end yield, because they are the things that are designating whether that is useful for a grower. So that is precisely what we're doing with this sort of data now, is to say, okay, we've got it across a number of sites, and we're lucky with breeders to see material earlier in the system, so we can really start to investigate them quite early, put them through their paces, give them the scores, and that gives a strong direction. If they then come up for recommendation and don't make it by 1.5% in yield or whatever it might be, well, that's a shame, but actually it's still most valuable for a grower. And now that's the issue, is that then, so you can say to breeders, now what I really, really want is a very competitive variety. I want something that moves quite quickly in the spring. And I'm interested in that trait. Yes, it's got to yield, but let's not throw these things out of the system or your system in breeding lines because you fear they might not make the recommended list by it's 1.5–2% or whatever it might be. What we really want to do is to rattle about amongst your genetics in your fields to give the traits that we want. So now, of course, we've been talking strongly about the VSRs, the way we operate it, what we're looking for. All of a sudden, we can get different sorts of crosses from breeders that may not necessarily be the highest yield, but have got the traits we believe that growers want. And all that leads to, really, at the end of the day, Tony, is resilience, safety, lack of risk. So something that you can grow reasonably happily, might be away from the farm. Obviously a lot of farms now got the ground a long way away from homestead, say, and they can reliably put them there and not have to worry that if they can't get there, tomorrow, it'll hang on for a few more days. And that, I think, is the real trick in the book right now.
Yeah, very good point there, Colin. But here's the question for you. How do we balance that with growing the crop for a specific end market use?
Absolutely the right thing to look at is then, of course, the quality grouping of varieties. So we haven't mentioned that before, but clearly, if a grower is living next to a user of soft group 3 biscuit varieties, as they have the mill down the road, and we're looking today at obviously transport costs, but also carbon footprint of everything. If it makes economic sense that we can supply, or he can supply under contract to that local end user or intermediary, what we need to do then, of course, is to ascertain that fairly early in the conversation, so we can look at that grouping of varieties and how one of those or a couple of those may be something more akin to a movement going forward on sort of fairly resilient terms, and see, is that a sensible offering for him? And, let's go back to the point. You go to Scotland, it's no point really talking about feed wheat too much. They want feed wheat, soft wheat for distilling. That's their local market. And when we go down to Kent, they want to be able to export. They do some quick exports out of sort of group 2 or 1 varieties. So there are market opportunities across the country. And so, yes, you're right. We have to fine tune the variety selection to the local market.
Yeah, and bringing all this together, this is such important information for growers and agronomists alike, isn't it? If you heard the phone going, that was indeed people searching for Colin's advice as he's about to step out this afternoon to do some busy variety tours. But pulling this together, how does this all link in with Agrii's Green Horizons initiative?
Yeah, it's a natural progression because, of course, what we're trying to do across the Green Horizon spectrum is we're talking about environmental aspects, we're talking about nutritional aspects, we're talking about soil structures and soil health, how to maximize the farm's value across the piece. And of course, part of that is so we work out our rotational position. Another important part of the whole program, and particularly in grass weeds, is, if we persist in doing the same thing all of the time and actually keep getting it wrong, well, then there comes a time when we need to do something about it. And so we show very much rotational positions, again, at Stow Longer in our work to reduce the levels of blackgrass, etc. So in other words, reducing the economic impact of that weed by good soil management and structure, and then choosing the right species to grow in that field, and then picking the right variety to go in that field. Now that's real fine tuning. So you're going across the whole spectrum of crop production, looking at it from a slightly different angle these days. Is absolutely right. Environmental impacts and everything else is really important, and soil health and biology. All those things all link in together. But ultimately, what we need to do is still to be able to grow a crop profitably, in amongst making sure that we can adhere to as many of these principles in Green Horizons as possible. And so it's a natural progression then to say, okay, so we've now decided the species, which variety, and then the breakdown of what rotational position is it in, what sort of soil type have we got, what's the local market, what's the local need, and can we afford on some of the area to be slightly more risky with a variety that might end up ultimately yielding more if that's the end game, but we just have to watch it a bit more carefully and spend a bit more money on it? Or do we also have a proportion of the farm that is safer in its varietal choice and resilience? So it's, I think, a great fit for a farming community that we can all get together and say, okay, what do we want? What are we trying to do? And this hopefully helps along the way to make that happen.
Thanks, Colin. And, we're coming to the end of our podcast now. We're recording this towards the end of June. What top tips would you give agronomists and growers right now?
What I'd implore is that we will be updating all the Agrii advisory list and VSR scores as soon as possible. Now we got another, say, 2 or 3 weeks of disease collection to see how it totally expresses across the country. We'll then run the numbers very quickly so we can turn it into solid advice for drilling this autumn. So yeah, by looking at the demos right now, it's giving you a very close idea as to where you want to go to, but we will further endorse that with final data as soon as possible in sort of towards the end of July. So at the moment, I'd say go and have a look at these things. If you can, come and have a look, come and have a conversation. We'd all love to see you. If you can't make it, the data will be available from Agrii agronomists, say late July, to just add that final validation, Tony. So hopefully we've fingers crossed we got all the angles covered by then, and we're good to go to make those final decisions on varieties before we go drilling this autumn.
Well, thank you, Colin, for a very enlightening insight as to how varietal selection fits within the bigger picture of farm profitability and sustainability. That's it for this podcast, but do tune in again as we meet the experts throughout the season, exploring the many immediate and longer-term questions for growers and farmers in the UK. If you have any questions that you would like us to ask the experts, email info@agrii.co.uk. See you next time.